Previously, I constructed the base for the aft funnel. In this video, I'm going to construct the MFDF structure and the motorboat workshop. The modifications for the MFDF structure mostly involve adding photo-etch. To that end, I'm going to replace the hatches with photo-etch and remove these ladders and replace them with photo-etch. In a future video, I'll be replacing the winches and these structures that hold boats with photo-etch. That means that in this video, I need to fill these holes. These holes were for those plastic components which will not be used. Taking a look at the motorboat workshop, there are modifications that need to be made to this part. According to the HMS Hood Association, this hatch and this ladder should not be present on the port side. They will be retained on the starboard side. And the windows at the back of the component have been erroneously modeled as gratings, and even the photo-etch kit has provided a grating replacement. This will need to be dug out and cut into the shape of windows, since they are not meant to be gratings. As can be seen from this image of the component, there are also two hatches that will need to be removed and replaced with photo-etch. Fortunately, that is the only set of modifications that I need to make to this component. To begin, I need to prepare the plastic components. After removing them from their sprue, I then remove excess plastic and flashing. For the most part, this is just clipping off that excess plastic where the components were connected to their sprue, but there is a little bit of flashing on the base of some of these components. It has been a common theme with this kit. There is a fair bit of flashing all over the place. Fortunately, as of this moment, I haven't found any of it that's been too bad. It is just something that you have to consistently deal with. After cleaning up the edges so that the components can fit together nicely, I can then glue them together. For a structure like this, where it's difficult to hold all the components together in the correct position, it's quite difficult to glue it together using extra thin plastic cement. So I prefer to glue it together using a thicker plastic cement. In this case, I'm using Revell Contactor Professional. I will be reinforcing this glue with extra thin plastic cement at a later stage. At this point, I'm using Revell Contactor Professional to simply tack the components together so that I'm able to correctly position them. Once I'm happy with how they are positioned, I can then firmly bond them in place with extra thin plastic cement. I like to reinforce bonds with extra thin plastic cement because it really gets pulled into the gap and you get a good bond across the entire length of the component, without any risk of glue being squeezed out and making an ugly effect on the exterior of the part. I just find that when you glue together a part using thick plastic cement, there's a greater chance of making a mess. So I try to use the thick plastic cement as sparingly as possible, just to get things properly aligned and initially tacked in place, and then properly bond them in place using an extra thin plastic cement. Since both of these structures, the motorboat workshop and MFDF structure, need to fit onto this larger aft base of the funnel, while the glue is still wet, I position them just to make sure that everything is going to fit together really well. I don't want there to be an issue that I have to deal with later on after the glue is set. Once I'm happy that the components are going to fit together well, I leave them to dry, and then I apply some plastic putty to the seam lines so that I can remove them. I also use plastic putty to fill these holes. These holes are for the plastic cable spools. I will be replacing those with photo-etch cable spools, so these holes need to be removed. And on the side, these large rectangular openings will also be filled with plastic putty. These are the holes for those structures that hold the boats. At this stage, the plastic ladders and hatches are still on the components. I'm going to remove those when I remove the excess plastic putty that I've applied. After giving the putty some time to dry, it then can be filed off, and at the same time I file off the plastic hatches and ladders. Although these components are not very detailed, they do have wriggles that I want to retain. I don't have a lot of photo-etch wriggles left, so I need to use them sparingly, and these ones aren't really problematic. Their level of detail is fine. That does mean I need to be careful with how I file and sand this area. Fortunately, it wasn't too difficult. There's not that much detail that needs to be retained anyway on these components, and I'm able to get it done. When finishing off the surface with sandpaper, I do need to protect those details by applying a piece of tape over the wriggles and then sanding the area with 400 grit sandpaper. Once sanding one section, I then remove the tape and sand the area that was previously covered by the tape. The same treatment needs to be given to the motorboat workshop. It is a smaller structure with a little bit less detail on it, which does make this slightly easier. Once the plastic hatches and ladders are removed and the seam lines have been filled, I then spray the components with Mr. Surfacer 500. This does reveal multiple defects. This is not surprising. So I'll go through another round of filling and sanding to correct those defects to ensure that I have a good looking smooth component. Now that I'm happy with the plastic components, I can start installing the photo-etch. I'm going to start with these hatches. These are the larger variety of hatches which do not fold well. They are horrible hatches. These are the worst hatches that I've ever had to deal with. They just don't align properly when you fold them. So I've taken to literally removing the frame from the door and then gluing the door into the frame in the correct position. This is the only way that you can get a decent looking outcome. If you don't do it this way, the door does not sit centered in the frame. Once I'm happy with the state of the hatches, they can be glued in place. I position them on the model dry and then hold them in place using tweezers. I then apply extra thin super glue to the edge of the hatch to bond it in place. This process is repeated for all of the hatches on this component. Next, I'm going to install sections of photo-etch ladder. I cut a section of ladder off of its fret and once again hold it in place using tweezers. I then bond it in place, also using extra thin super glue that I apply with a wire, and then after it has been properly attached to the model, I clip it to length. I repeat this process until all of the ladders have been installed on these two components. On the motorboat workshop, on the upper section, there is yet another hatch that needs to be installed. This is the smaller variety of a hatch. This is the type of hatch in this kit that actually does fold quite nicely. So I'll fold it together and then hold it in place using tweezers, after which I apply extra thin super glue to the edge to bond it closed. I then apply a drop of extra thick super glue to the surface onto which I want to install the hatch, and then place the hatch on top of the drop of super glue. Before the super glue sets, I position the hatch with tweezers. Now to construct the cradles for the boats. I do need to be a little bit careful when constructing these components. They are actually all different. So I need to make sure that I have the right set, otherwise one leg which is longer than the other leg won't be on the right side and then these things won't fit together properly. So I do need to make sure that I've got this right. There is a convenient line etched into these plates which does fit this bracing structure quite nicely. Found the best way to do this is to position and hold in place this bracing structure using tweezers and then apply extra thin super glue to the base. It is delicate work, but it isn't too difficult to do, and it doesn't take long for me to construct both of these cradles. I then apply a small drop of extra thick super glue to the base of one of the support struts and position it. Once I'm happy with the position, I then reinforce the bond and glue down the other support strut using extra thin super glue. And once again, I repeat the process for the other side of the structure. I'm now going to deal with these windows, these gratings that should actually be windows on the motorboat workshop. My initial thought was to just dig out the grating using a screwdriver and then paint the inside with black and I'd get a good effect. But unfortunately, it was very difficult to get a nice smooth edge for the frame, and it really looked very rough. So I decided to go and actually make a new frame. This meant that I needed to dig out a large gap for the entire length of the top section of that motorboat workshop where those windows were, and then build out of styrene stock a nice new frame which could then be inserted into that gap and filled it with putty to create a nice clean effect. To construct the frame, I used 0.5 by 0.25 millimeter styrene stock that I cut to length using the chopper. I then glued the frame together using Revell Contactor Professional and extra thin plastic cement. I then placed the frame into the gap that I had opened up in the plastic and glued it in place using extra thin plastic cement. The gaps on the sides of the frame I then filled in with plastic putty, and after giving the plastic putty some time to dry, I then filed off the excess. To check the quality of the finish, I then sprayed it with Mr. Surfacer. It filled in some micro scratches and revealed a few defects that I then corrected with a second round of filing and sanding. To check that I'm happy with the state of these frames, I decided to fill them with black panel line. This isn't going to be the final panel line that goes in here. I'm going to be spraying this area with XF53 at a later stage, so this will be covered up. But I just wanted to make sure that the panel line flowed nicely and I got nice clean edges on these frames. And I did. I'm quite happy with the effect. So that then completes the construction of the MFDF platform and the Motorboat workshop. These structures can now be connected to the base for the aft funnel, and the final details can be installed. If you would like to support this channel or see how this ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.